Hello, and welcome to the Security Strategist. I'm Richard Stiennon, Chief Research Analyst at IT Harvest. I write books on IT security, and I work with IT security technology providers on their go-to-marketing, and I'm a trusted advisor to VCs and private equity firms. Today, I'm speaking to Adeel Ahmad from HashiCorp and Grant Webb, who's a cloud technologist, about the innovation paradox. So why don't we start off with you, Grant, and tell me how you see the balance between innovation and security, and why is it a paradox in today's business environment?
Thanks, Richard. It's a great question. And I think in reality, it's something that is improving with time. But I think, there still is a challenge there with regards to that paradox that actually exists. I think, one of the key challenges that we need to recognize is that innovation is fundamentally about change, and security is fundamentally about staying safe. And arguably the greatest risk to staying safe is change itself. So it's still something that very much exists today. And I think there remains a number of kind of misconceptions around the adoption of security as part of the innovation challenge. I think we can't talk about them all today, but certainly one that stands out to me is really a notion that security is something that slows you down. It's a question that was often posed to me whilst working at cloud vendors, helping, customers adopt cloud technology. This question of whether security, or this statement that security slows you down. And there's a number of different answers that, I've heard over the time, from no to yes to it doesn't, it shouldn't, but it does, etc. But I think one of the things for me that I always talk about is no, it doesn't slow you down, but only if you do from the start.
Yeah, that brings to mind my favorite quote from Bill Malik, a former Gartner analyst, my favorite analyst. And he used the analogy to brakes on a car. And he said, why do we have brakes on a car? And people would say, so we can stop. And he'd say, no, we have brakes on a car so you can go fast. And if security is the brakes on the car, how can you leverage it to help you go faster?
Absolutely.
So, Adeel, the innovation paradox often pits security against productivity. How can technology leadership, CIOs and CISOs, embed security in a way that drives innovation and supports business growth rather than slowing it down?
Thanks, Richard. And I love that analogy about using the brakes to speed up. It reminds me of those car racing films, right, where they do drifting and they'd have to pull the handbrakes up while they're turning, and actually that makes them go faster. And you could say that's analogous to what we want to do here around this innovation and speed. But I would echo some of the things that Grant mentioned around these conflicting objectives. And as long as they remain conflicting, then they will continue to slow down. And so the key pieces I suppose to understand is that if you look at security in isolation and do not look at the wider holistic context, then that in itself adds certain friction, especially if we understand some of the risk, probability or risk tolerance rather. And that risk tolerance should always be contextual to the business. This really kind of helps me think, or rather, I'm always wondering, the way to solve this, could this really be more of a business organizational change, not necessarily just culture, but reporting lines and org charts, and how that really has a massive effect. If people are incentivized correctly, then that would help with that innovation and security. The other thing actually I want to kind of touch on, Richard, you were talking about how to speed up, right? And it feels like that's a principal objective around speeding up. Does that in itself mean that actually security seems to be a hindrance, or rather, actually, how is it that we have people who are working around innovation are also incentivized to ensure that they add security, or at least ensure the security embedded in their workflows? All of this really kind of, to answer your question, I feel like it leads down ensuring how do we, at an organizational chart perspective, correctly incentivize the different various organizations to start thinking of each other.
Yeah, when I think of, I usually think of innovation coming from security vendors, but within an organization, adapting new technology is innovative, and creating new processes to match a new threat environment certainly is involving innovation. But I think the paradox arises a lot from regulations, in that you've already are working towards a framework, and you've got auditors, internal and external, who are going to ask you to comply with certain regulations. And that just creates a burden. Every time you do innovate, you have to know how it fits into your compliance regime and whether it generates new reporting requirements, new logging requirements. And that's the other dichotomy, which is that between security operations, where people are just stopping bad stuff from happening, and the requirements from regulators. And of course, we've got new regulations, and we're entering this phase where the regulators are catching up with the idea that, we've got privacy issues. We do have requirements for critical infrastructure to be secure, and it's all being piled on at once. And the temptation is, okay, we're going to stop changing. We're just going to get really good at complying. What are your thoughts on that, Adeel?
So that's an interesting point you made there. And I feel these requirements, whether it's a security requirement or a regulation requirement, is evergreen. They will remain so. So I feel that there is an unfair reflection on pointing the fingers towards, say, the regulation being the problem, rather than actually, there's a point you made about, Richard, that you said processes need to change to reflect new technology. And maybe there's the problem, right? Maybe the problem here is that, hey, we do have this regulation. However, the way we do things in the enterprise, all of that seems to be audited or governed or reviewed right at the end or just before release, as opposed to kind of embedding that during design and having that process of iteration. So to answer your question, I don't think the current model and that operating model ways of working and this linear approach that reflects how we did things back in the 90s and with less scale, we're still using that vehicle. And obviously with new regulations and new security, all that's doing is just exacerbating that. But I don't think the regulation in itself is the cause. Curious to hear Grant's thought on that.
Yes, I'm very much in agreement. I mean, regulation is a challenge. I think it's a challenge that exacerbates an existing problem. For a long time, organizations have found challenge with keeping up pace, whether it be with regards to competitiveness and cost, more recently sustainability, for example. I think regulation is another thing in that in tray that organizations need to worry about. And I think to your point, Richard, about regulators catching up and the pace of regulatory change actually accelerating, I think that then comes back to, again, one of those more traditional problems where we often, in organizations, seek to embark on project or program to try to address some of these challenges. They are typically point-in-time exercises where we set out to achieve a regulatory goal in a time period. But of course, the reality is things change. And therefore, how do we get ourselves into a situation where we can constantly stay current? So, that transformation should be deemed as a constant and not a program. And we need to, and that becomes very much about, it's much less about what we do and much more about how we do it. And that very much comes back to that kind of organizational and cultural construct that we've already talked about.
There's a good example, actually. Recently, end of last year, at the SEC in America have published the mandate for cybersecurity disclosures to happen in the annual 10K. And also if cybersecurity incidents happen that are deemed material for a public organization to be disclosed. Ultimately, when you look deep into it, what they're asking in terms of disclosure around, okay, well, these cybersecurity incidents that happened, how much of that has impacted the organization financially or their business operations? Similarly, the annual 10K, CISOs are required to report in their current cyber risks and that risk profile and essentially how bad that is. But also they need to kind of articulate what they will do about it in terms of improving. In reality, from a technology perspective, nothing's changed, or rather from a security requirements perspective, not much has changed. All that's happened is there's now an added urgency that's come from an external body that's kind of driving a lot of that urgency, especially given that with this SEC ruling, CISOs are now personally liable and may be subject to criminal litigation. But back to Grant's point, if you have a good operating model, and something that Grant actually touched on is around this establishing a practice of continuous transformation. I feel with the way the industry today, at least in America, in the US, in response to the SEC, may be in a state of concern and top of mind. Maybe that goes away if the internalized transformation and model were to be strong.
You know, it occurs to me that HashiCorp, I think, is known to our audience as kind of the epitome of innovation, right? Changed the way people do business, grew rapidly. And you must have had to encounter, you know, as you grow on your own side, your security teams and compliance teams, and have had to face this. Are there any lessons learned from your own experience, or if not that, then from your customers' experience?
100%. And actually, there's a good example that comes from this that I can think of recently, where I'm responsible for technical go-to-market, and we're looking at understanding those kind of industry problems and how do we map our solutions, or rather, how do we ensure that our technical solutions correlate back up to those business impact and business outcomes, and ensuring that it resonates. At which point, if it's framed right, our tools don't get siloed into as a security product or an infrastructure product. And a good example is around HCP Packer and Terraform that many people know. At face value, it does address a lot of the kind of golden image workflow and standardization. However, if look at from a security perspective, then your state of vulnerabilities and the long life of those vulnerabilities in your estate, if you had all your digital estates under infrastructure as code management and you had a continuous refresh, then the lifespan of those vulnerabilities are now drastically reduced. And this is obviously agnostic to that whole refresh. The point I'm making here is that this is an example of what we're doing internally, where we do have those detective controls and detecting vulnerabilities. However, the principal medium of bringing those vulnerabilities under control is through this kind of continuous reprovisioning every 30 days, agnostically across our entire estate. And that would inherently minimizing the lifespan of vulnerabilities. So that's a good lesson that I feel that internally we've learned from, and we're now wanting to share that to the world.
Got it. That really makes sense. So Grant, you talked about processes and how to improve developer relationships with the security teams, help those CIOs, CISOs solve these business problems?
Yeah, so I think this is something that I've experienced firsthand. I think it is about relationships and it is about integration. But I think one of the challenges is that we still have, from a thought process perspective, we still have, make a very clear distinction between security and, software engineering. So we still see them as separate things. And as long as they remain perceived as separate things, I think the challenge will continue. So therefore, the trick becomes on how do you integrate them? One of the things that I think is quite important is to create a notion of shared fate. So in many organizations, because of the separation between change and safety, you have this unfortunate situation where one can fail and one can succeed. So you can keep an organization safe and succeed from a security perspective, but actually if you have a change agenda and you can't change it due to security, then arguably you failed. So if you can create a notion of shared fate in your organization between your teams across those organizational structures through common objectives, for example. So as opposed to giving your security teams, the stay safe agenda and the engineering teams, the change agenda, if you can bring those together for a common set of objectives between both, which is notionally safe change, then that makes a big difference to how you're going to progress. And I think one of the key elements that you can do to help achieve that and build in those relationships is by bringing together those teams and almost kind of encouraging this notion of bidirectional empathy. So allow platform engineering and security teams to see the challenges that product teams have, but also at the same time allow product teams to see the challenges that security and platform engineering teams. So when you develop that kind of bidirectional empathy between those teams to understand, the requisite responsibilities, it starts to improve the actual collaborative nature and the open conversation between them. So I think it's really down to a sense of community, to not think of them as separate and really start to bring together those things with a common objective to change safely.
You're giving me a little PTSD because the last time I worked in a large organization was before security and networks were a thing. And I'm just trying to think of how some of the good executives accomplished that, right? And having shared KPIs was one of them. And it's easiest when it has something to do with finance because that's very measurable. And so the president of the division of a conglomerate I was in would say, hey, look at all your bonuses are going to be based on X. And in this case, it was return on assets. But that got everybody pulling in the same direction. There was a similar tension back then between the product engineers, me, and the manufacturing plant who had to build the stuff that we designed. Now, obviously, you got to get those two teams talking together and pulling towards the same goal, creating the lightest, cheapest, easiest to manufacture product possible that fulfills the engineering teams. And that involved meetings, going down to the plant and having a plant launch. And it also involved a lot of Jack Daniels, as I recall. Are you suggesting that simple things like that, the two teams get together for pizza on Friday should occur?
There is that culture piece for sure. But I've seen something also interesting is to the point around shared KPIs is that shared accountability. And to achieve that, there is, yes, the notion of the culture at that ground level. But one bank that I was speaking to, a large global bank, we saw an interesting pattern in their org chart where the CISO, instead of being a peer to the CIO, was reporting to the CIO. At which point now, interestingly, although the CISO is still accountable for the security aspect, because the CIO is now equally accountable for both security and innovation, there will be an interesting kind of ripple effect where the CISO will now have to take into interest of the CIO's overall objective. So I thought that's an interesting move, and maybe at least from a CEO perspective, the first and quick move to make, and see how that starts to take effect.
As the last question, what creative approaches have you seen amongst HashiCorp customers where CIOs or CISOs are adapting to stay ahead of security threats and the demand for increased business productivity? Because there's often a gap in understanding between the idea of security and business productivity.
For sure. So some of the approaches we've seen, and recently actually, given there is both objectives around whether that's innovation or around security, and especially security. I think the challenge for the CISO, although yes, we're always seeing the apparent pieces where their mandate and their objectives are coming at the cost of innovation, but equally, the adoption of those security mandates are very low. And what we're seeing is this increasing pressure to ensure that those security objectives are still met from an adoption perspective. And that's hard to do centrally without the buy-in from the developers or from the people that are responsible for deploying infrastructure. And so recently what we started to see in the last few years are security teams now approaching these platform teams and platform engineering to see if there is an opportunity to partner together and embed some of those security practices, especially with the advent of platform engineering, where they are becoming this shop front, being a producer-consumer model and presenting these cloud products ready to deploy into the cloud for application developers. Security team are now seeing an opportunity to say, hey, is there an opportunity where we can embed those security requirements as part of that without then kind of increasing the cognitive load with developers? So to your point, I think these are some of the creativities we see. And actually, certainly Grant and I, one thing I think we haven't said here, that we, in a past life, Grant and I, we worked together in a bank, and we ourselves personally have gone through that creative experience ourselves when we were building that kind of cloud center of excellence and really reaching out and working with security and compliance team and ensuring we try to embed some of that into the products. I mean, Grant, you want to share some of that experience as well?
Yeah, and I think, again, a lot of that was about those relationships that needed to be built, that we had to learn that needed to be built. I think because it was a learning experience, I think it's safe to say for both of us and everyone involved. I think we did get creative. We certainly started to look at some of the things we've already talked about, those common objectives, that kind of how could we instill that kind of bi-directional empathy that I talked about. And we also had to make other decisions around focus. When you embark on some of these programs, they're of a magnitude that are, they're almost insurmountable as they're written down. You have to learn to break these things down and iterate through them and focus on one thing and do one thing well. And we had a lot of learnings as part of those experiences. I think if we just expand slightly on the creative means from a technical perspective, I think that it's fair to say the world's changed. Adeel's talking about a situation that was 4 or 5 years ago now, and obviously technology has moved on. And I think it's really interesting and powerful innovation recently in this space, specifically around AI, for example, and specifically generative AI in terms of, how there are offerings out there now that are really helping organizations, if they're organized correctly, to manage these threats better. We can simulate threat better than we ever could before using some of these technologies. And also we've seen an emergence of technology vendors offering managed services in these spaces as well. The retention of service around managed response, etc., that we're starting to see a number of organizations start to employ. So you establish your own center of excellence internally for security, but you've also got that kind of additional support from a third party who's also got your back as well. And we're seeing the emergence of more and more organizations offering those kind of services. I think that's one thing that I certainly reflect on, in that the 4 or 5 years ago have absolutely flown by, but the amount of innovation specifically in the security space and the services offered has just exploded. So I think some of the things that I've seen and some of those kind of creative ways that organizations are starting to deal with this challenge.
Adeel, Grant, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate your coming on. Also, thank you to everyone listening. We hope you took a lot away from today's podcast. For further information on what we've talked about, please head over to HashiCorp.com. We'll be back next week with another episode in our podcast series. Until then, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on all major platforms and follow the conversation on our socials at EM360Tech on Twitter and LinkedIn. And for some great daily content, head over to em360tech.com.